Welcome to the How HR Leaders Change the World podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Crossley, and each week we explore how the work of HR leaders is also creating positive social change, contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goals which the world's companies are increasingly understanding the urgency of achieving and investing in the action required. If you'd like clear, actionable ideas for how you can use the power of your role to affect change in your company, you're in the right place. Following a corporate upbringing, I founded the social enterprise From Babies with Love. We provide services to HR leaders, and through this work, I realised that HR professionals and social entrepreneurs are working in the same areas, albeit in different ways. So we created this podcast to share knowledge on steps we can take through the work of HR. In my opinion, if you're an HR professional, you are also a change maker. And this podcast will provide you with examples of how. By sharing the successes of some of the world's most inspiring HR leaders, you can frame your work in the context of positive change, implement brilliant ideas, and feel absolutely wonderful about doing so. A very big welcome to Jim Devine, who is the Group HR Director at Spirax Sarco Engineering PLC. And Jim, welcome. And for any of our listeners that are not in the engineering sector or familiar with engineering, may I ask you to introduce yourself and Spirax Sarco and your role within it?
Hi, so I'm Jim Devine. I'm the Group HR Director. I've been there 5 years, and we're a big company you've probably never heard of. So we're a FTSE 100 company that's in over 60 countries, and I would call us or describe us as a consultative selling company that really improves customers' processes by using our technology.
Thank you, Jim. And it's brilliant that you mentioned the number of countries, the 60 countries that you operate in, because here on the podcast, we love to talk about global perspectives and global impact. So many of the challenges we face in the world today, I think, require a global approach and global cooperation. And I think your role in leading across all those different regions and cultures is going to be fascinating to hear about. Thank you for sharing that background. And may I dive into our questions that we ask our HR leaders, the first of which is, as an HR leader whose influence creates social change, what do you feel has been your most impactful action to date?
I think actually it's been part of the team that I'm in. So the leadership team that I'm part of has collectively grown the organisation, in terms of its value about 4 times. And then by doing that, we've got more influence, and we're trying to use that positively. So trying to provide, more better qualified employment for all our colleagues, and operating responsibly in all the countries we operate in, from the world's most mature economies right through to the most underdeveloped. And in doing that, trying to be values-based, to do things for the long term, to be sustainable and to be purposeful. I've got a role within the team to try and provide a bit of a lens on a decision-making, to make sure we're taking them all into account.
And you mentioned there, Jim, the variety of markets that you operate in. And I was wondering if you have any examples, perhaps at either end, from most developed to least, of a decision you took or a practice or policy you implemented that supported colleagues in that market in their employment, that would be interesting to share?
I think it's difficult to answer that question without focusing back to what we've just been through in 2020, and it was important that in all of our markets we had absolute standards for safety of all our employees, whether they be in the USA or Myanmar, and we wanted to have local flexibility so that people could react to the environment they're operating in, but we wanted to have minimum standards. And even if in country X you were allowed to do something that we didn't think was of the right level of standard or care for our employees, we didn't allow that to happen. And if that meant potentially negative commercial implications on us, that's what we did. And that's sort of how just consistent standards can be applied across the world. So we talk about minimum standards, right? So everywhere in the world, we should have a minimum standard of, how our employees were treated. We rolled out a global employee assistance program, but it was important for us that you had to be able to access that in Myanmar, as well as the USA, as well as the UK, as well as France or any other developed economy. And some of that's easier said than done, but we did do that. So the employee assistance program is global and is available in all the 66 countries we operate in. And some more mature economies might be more familiar with these things, but it was quite refreshing to see in some of the countries we operate in where these concepts were not understood and had a huge positive impact, I think.
That's such a great example, Jim. Thank you. And if any of our listeners are perhaps also working on a project that has some minimum standards globally or is thinking about doing something like that, you mentioned there that you chose to prioritise people even if there were negative commercial consequences, and that tension, the cost tension always exists. But I was wondering if I could ask, if our listeners are facing that challenge in a similar kind of project, what advice would you give as the best ways to make the case for having a global minimum to support people?
I think you've got to think about it is what will benefit you over the medium term, not even the long term, but the medium term. So quite quickly, my colleagues and I knew that people remember whether or not you live to your values at the tough times, not in the good times, right? And we were very clear that was going to be front of mind, because we believe that over the longer period, the 3, 4, 5 year period, that people will look back and remember how they were treated and remember how their colleagues were treated as well. So, an example being at the peak of the pandemic, when, like most people, back in March, April, when no one knew where the world was going to be, some of our businesses did implement some basic pay cuts, not all just for senior people. And we made sure before year end that we paid all that back because we could afford to, and it was the right thing to do. And we also, it's not completely commercially naive, we also believe, difficult to prove, but we also believe that people will remember that, and that has a business benefit. So I think the short answer to your question is think about the impact of what you're doing over the longer term. And, if you're a business that wants to retain its employees, they will remember how you behaved when it was tough. That's kind of when you show your true colours. And if you can hold to your values at that moment, you'll get benefits in the longer term. So I guess short answer would be think longer term benefits, not just short term managing a scenario.
Thank you, Jim. And yeah, it really is encouraging to hear you sharing that longer term perspective, because again, resolving any global challenge, I think, does require that medium, not necessarily even longer, like you say, but medium term thinking for the investment that's required. And thinking more broadly now for question 2 about the engineering sector, may I ask, what do you think is the most exciting opportunity for HR within that sector to make a contribution to changing the world?
I think there's a bit of a perfect storm, and I mean that in a positive sense, not a negative sense. At the minute, where COVID's been just an accelerator, it's not a defining factor. And for I guess this is an HR podcast, right? So David Ulrich, the HR guru, talks about outside in HR, and I've seen in the last 5 years, and more so in the last 2 years, the rise of what they call the ESG investor community. I've been asked more questions from shareholders, about what I do. I think people talk about purpose as a defining factor, and the broader sort of inclusion and wellbeing debate. So I think there's a chance for HR, probably in all sectors, to actively influence what external stakeholders think about their organisation, as much as the finance director and everyone else. And my kind of message to the HR community is it's a time to be bold, because I think the opportunity for HR to shape corporate direction, not just corporate culture, but corporate direction, and it has never been more so than now. And for those that are in UK PLCs, the whole broader, for those that are in FTSE companies, the whole role or focus on corporate governance is just putting people further in the agenda. So, for example, I kind of interface with 3 of the main board committees. That probably wouldn't have been the case a number of years ago for someone in my role. So I think COVID's just accelerated it. It hasn't caused it; it's accelerated it. So I think kind of carpe diem, right? Seize the day, I think would be my.
I love those bold statements, Jim, and I really do agree with you on the opportunity for HR leaders to be shaping entire corporate direction, because all companies are made up of people. And I also agree that we knew that before, but recently, and accelerated by the pandemic, we're remembering that almost. And without people, well, what's the point? Nothing's done and there's nothing to do for anybody. So it's like, well, of course, the HR director has to be interfacing with all key executives and stakeholders. But it seems almost too obvious to say it out loud, doesn't it? But there we go. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. And our third question is to ask to share something a little more personal, an area of social or environmental injustice that you personally care about and feel passionate about, but connecting that back to your role as a group HR director, to perhaps any examples you have of how your role is enabling you to contribute to that issue you care about.
Yeah, I think this question sort of made me reflect quite a bit. And when I think back how I ended up pursuing a career in HR, from leaving university, it was kind of about this fascination about how organizations work. I didn't even know if I didn't know it was a thing. I didn't know it was a career. And so it's kind of started there. And I think there was a shift in the financial crash about organizations had to do things for the right reasons, right? And that's morphed into sustainability. And I think for me, the one that I think is good business, but I feel most strongly about is the broad subject of inclusion, so that people can be themselves at work without any fear. And I think it's great. It just makes so much sense to me, because they're only going to do more better work, right? So why wouldn't you do that in the first place? So for me, over the years, we probably used the words engagement quite a lot, or talent management and various other things. And I think for me, the inclusion and equitable treatment of all my colleagues, wherever or whatever they want to be, is really important. But what's great about it is to me, it completely aligns with good business as well. So I don't think the things need to be mutually exclusive. And I think within our own particular sector, maybe there's one thing to highlight is, we are an engineering group. So, improving the gender balance of those in STEM careers is really important. And, that continues to be a big focus for us as an organisation, because, if 50% of the population are less likely to pursue a career in your sector, that's not very helpful. So I think, in short answer, inclusion in its broadest sense, and because I think it's the right thing to do and it's great business. And within our business, females in STEM-orientated careers, and just, continuing to encourage that, because it's just, again, it's the right thing to do, but it's good business as well. And I never see these things as mutually exclusive.
How HR Leaders Change the World is brought to you by From Babies with Love, and this episode is sponsored by our very own parental leave gift service. We help solve the challenge of connecting with colleagues across parental leave and in returning to work, contributing to talent retention and so too gender balance strategy. From Babies with Love donates 100% of its profits to orphaned and abandoned children. Your beautiful, sustainably sourced From Babies with Love gifts come with the story of how your company is also helping a less fortunate child, creating meaningful engagement. We transform spend that so often already takes place on flowers or products that don't have the Sustainable Development Goals at their heart. We transform that spend to become a consistent, inclusive and strategic part of your working parents programme. Ask us to tell you more at frombabieswithlove.org. Make an impact at a defining moment. And are you finding in any of your regions there are particular challenges to fostering inclusion that you're finding good learning experiences from, that you're able to take across to other cultures and other geographies?
Yeah, so a very, very topical question, actually. So in April, we ran a global employee survey, and we've had a very high response rate. So it's not finalised yet, but it'll probably near, if not more than 90% globally. But in doing that, I wanted to get more insight as to the makeup of all our colleagues globally. So I wanted to ask questions about race, sexual orientation, how they classify themselves from a gender perspective. And you can't do that in every country in the world. And, you had to, poor Darren Towers and Jenny Forrester, who worked for me, did an outstanding job of working through all 66 of those geographies and working out what can and what can't you ask. And in some countries, some of these things are illegal. And I give you an example. Russia was a country where, if you ask about sexuality, there are complications around that. And so, the Middle East and other places you're probably more familiar with, places like Saudi Arabia. So kind of trying to navigate that, and realizing that your own sort of, background of being in the UK, which is actually, in employment terms, probably more aligned to the US than many other countries. In the UK and the US, there's an established history about asking about people's racial origin. Even in mainland Europe, that's not the case. So a very recent example of, going through that on a country-by-country basis. But we did it because we wanted to send a message. And I'll be interested to see how people respond to that. But it provoked a great debate too, and with other colleagues and leaders. Why do you need to know that? Why are you asking that? And that I would just reassure colleagues, if you're getting that response when you're working in the broad area of inclusion, see it as an opportunity, not a challenge. That's a great chance to have a conversation to say, well, funny you asked that, because it's really important to me to know if people from a certain group feel differently about working here than others, and is it inclusive? So that would be one where, there isn't one size fits all, and it's probably more differentiated than you'd think. The world is not the experience that most UK people have, but worth the effort. And I'd encourage others to go down that route as well. And happy to share experiences should you want to take that challenge on.
Yeah, and thank you very much for sharing that example of that challenge. It must, and the colleagues that worked on it with you, it must have been a huge project. So it's great to hear that you have got all the results coming in, and we'll be able to take steps from that, I'm sure. And you also just briefly touched on STEM for your industry in particular, and half the world's population perhaps not choosing to apply for roles in engineering. And you also have talked about having a medium and long-term perspective. I imagine that in trying to solve the flow of talent into engineering, you are having to take a medium to long-term perspective in terms of perhaps girls' education. Would that be right? And is that forming part of your HR strategy?
Yeah, and it's part of a broader business approach. So as part of actually sits within sustainability group strategy, there is a desire to increase the sort of positive impact we have in the communities in which we work, and that's twofold. So that is one, using the resources and skills of the organisation to make the environments in which we work and the communities which we work in better. And the second thing is social mobility through education. So it's not quite gender specific as such, but increasing sponsoring educational or promoting educational opportunities as a way to sustainably, lift people out of poverty is another aspect of that thrust. And on the gender part, we have a Future Leaders program, which is like a global graduate program we started in 2016, and it operates across the world. And we collectively, myself and the leadership team, set an objective that even though it was a STEM-orientated program, we would aim for 50-50 gender balance, male-female. And I know it's broader than that as people classify their own gender going forward. And we thought it would be impossible. But we've achieved or exceeded that every year since 2016. So part of it is just focusing on it. And interestingly, actually, the UK is one of the tougher places to actually achieve that. And some other countries in the world, we operate a lot in China. There isn't this sort of, I think the male gender orientation in STEM is maybe more of an issue in the UK than it is in some other cultures around the world that are not burdened by those sorts of stereotypes. So it's a bit of a long answer to your question, but they would be the kind of things to focus on. And I see them as that's just a core part of my role. It's the right thing to do, but as I always say, it's good business as well. And our stakeholders and shareholders are asking us about this every day, to be honest. So it aligns with purpose, however you look at it.
Yeah, I really agree, Jim. And I appreciate that you mentioned that STEM work is led by your sustainability team. Yet you related it completely to, we're talking about the context of the flow of talent into your sector and your company. And I often say that, I see people strategy and corporate responsibility as two sides of the same coin. So, that example that you've just shared, makes me believe that even more. It's a brilliant one, and very interesting to hear the compare and contrast of China and a European country there as well. And question 4, Jim, is about equity and inclusion, which we've just been talking about, some brilliant examples there. And it's very much within the context of how a more equitable and inclusive environment is delivering your business goals, which, again, you've mentioned you're a firm believer that is the case. And I was just wondering if you have any other examples of success from recent initiatives that you've implemented that you would like to share.
One angle on the broad inclusion debate that I don't think necessarily gets enough airtime is the fact that I'll use myself as an example, right? I am a white middle-aged male, right? Okay, so you might think simplistically, why would that have much to do with you? Surely it's all about people who are not like you, okay? And actually, I always remind people that, please don't assume that people who may have a certain gender or seen as being part of the majority, for want of a better word, that this isn't as important to them. Might not be about them, but it's for them. And I think when you focus on this, that's why I deliberately use the word inclusion. Darren, who works for us, it's inclusion, diversity, and wellbeing. So after 25 years of saying D&I, I've had to kind of unlearn that. And it was deliberate when we created Darren's role. The focus is inclusion, and that's everyone. So, for example, trying to focus on areas that affect a broad part of our employee base. So, for example, carers' responsibility. It might not be obvious when you look across your workforce, who's got that responsibility. It's non-gender specific. It's not related to someone's sexual orientation or ethnicity. But it could be a big part of their lives and their responsibility. So embracing that is a way of bringing inclusion to everybody as opposed to a series of distinct groups. And I think my one thing would be is just because an individual might not be part of the group that you're talking about or the underrepresented group that you're talking about, they want to be part of an organisation that's bothered about that. And I don't think we see that enough, actually.
That's a really important point to raise, Jim. And that example of caring responsibilities that you mentioned, that I agree, just everybody has some kind of caring responsibilities, even if it's only just caring for yourself, which you mentioned wellbeing. And of course, to do good work, we all need to be in a good fit mental, physical state to do so. But that example of caring responsibilities I thought was particularly interesting, just to ask you about a little more, given the role that everybody has had in caring for themselves and probably other people too during the pandemic. Has Darren and your and his team done anything that you would consider brand new or just a different and unconventional approach that you found worked really well that would be useful for others to learn from?
It's difficult because we're on the verge of rolling a number of things out, actually, and I can't kind of steal Darren's thunder, but actually having global minimum standards are on a number of employment policies across all countries in the world, regardless of whether or not it's market practice or not, is approach that we're taking, not just with carers, but more broadly. And later this year, employees in Spirax will see that. And that's kind of a bold statement, because in some countries in the world, if you just think about employment practices, and even some of the developed economies, like, accepted practice in the US is very different from Germany. But just because it's accepted practice in the US, that doesn't mean to say that it's accepted practice for us. Okay, so that would be one. And I think this whole COVID period is, I'm, working from home at the minute, as I'm based in the UK, as most of us are, even though we might gravitate back. And, I've been on calls, and I've got a young daughter, and, like everyone else, your home life is more visible to your colleagues. And, that's not all being negative, but, you've got to be kind of empathetic. And I think, as I say, if you think about the positives in COVID, to me, it's just accelerated a number of things, because it's almost, someone described it as the biggest workforce psychological experiment in history that's likely never to be repeated again, fingers crossed. Okay, so there's a lot you can learn from it, positive and negative. And the whole wellness agenda, it was a point of conversation with us before. We were kind of struggling to how do you do this globally? I actually was a little bit skeptical, if I was honest, a couple of years ago about to what extent it was a truly global conversation, or was it kind of like a UK-US developed economy type conversation? And it's not. It really isn't. It's one thing that resonates around, in every country we're in. So, COVID, for example, made us accelerate a global offering around employee wellbeing and assistance. That we'd been talking about, but the case for it was more obvious. So we for a crazy 10 days in April, we jumped on that and got the investment and got it out there. So I think global standards, regardless of the market, would be is something that we're looking to do. We haven't done, and there'll be a lot more to come, I guess, on that going forward.
Yeah, brilliant, Jim. And I'm going to keep an eye on your LinkedIn feed to look out for what those initiatives are, and I'll make sure I connect with Darren as well and learn from you both. Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. So we're on to our final question, which people often tell me is the hardest, because we like to be very specific so that our listeners can choose to implement something that's tangible and practical and feels accessible to everybody to do, having listened to your thoughts today. So it's to ask for one specific action that you would like to see all HR leaders and all HR professionals take to make a positive change for the world.
I think it's I mentioned earlier, there's a perfect storm in a positive sense, I think, for HR. And I guess I'm talking in the context of I work for a listed company in the UK, okay? So that's my kind of environment. But, all our stakeholders are becoming more aligned and interested in about what HR does. And by that, I mean, shareholders definitely much more interested than ever before, and increasingly so. Employees want to, there's the whole drive about purpose, about engagement, and people, wanting to work for an organization that kind of does good or attempts to do what it does in a good, sustainable way. And the HR community, I think, should feel bold or emboldened that, shareholders are not just for your finance director. They are as interested in what you do. And in our organization, we're unusual in some ways that the head of talent also works in investor relations as well, because we believe that the external and the internal have to be aligned. And that individual speaks to shareholders a lot, and the amount of questions about what HR directors own is high. So I guess use that to be bold, and the things that they're asking about, like inclusion, like purpose, like sustainability, like being an ethical employer, are all core to HR. And so be bold and bring that external perspective into your leadership teams, and maybe look to educate them as to what your stakeholders are interested in, and how the HR agenda aligns with that. It's not just the finances and the bottom line. It's very much on the how as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear your perspective, Jim, because there is a campaign at the moment which is advocating to change the segment of the Companies Act here in the UK that, in layperson's terms, essentially says, the purpose of a company is to give cash to shareholders. And when I say shareholders, I think I picture, like the dad from Mary Poppins, kind of that's what a shareholder is. And of course, that's way too narrow to make any sense, certainly within the context of the SDGs and life. And what you're describing is the role of HR in broadening the perspective of internal and external communication and what a company does deliver to its shareholders and interacts with them, and educating them, as you say, about what they should be caring about in the medium and long term, not just the quarterly results from the FD.
Yeah, and totally, and it's definitely changed. I've seen it in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not going back. And when big investors like the big investor funds like BlackRock, right, probably most high profile, when they're asking you, your CFO, or asking questions about your Glassdoor profile, right? I remember that 3 years ago, the then CFO phoning me up saying, I've been asked questions about Glassdoor, what's that? And it's part of their investment choice. So they are making decisions based on these things. It's about the how, not just the what, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And as the HR community is a big influence as to how an organisation does what it does, the profession has a chance to kind of embrace that, I think.
Brilliant, Jim. Thank you so much for sharing all those fascinating examples. It's been wonderful to hear from you, and I'm very proud to feature you here on How HR Leaders Change the World.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of How HR Leaders Change the World. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a moment to leave a review, a 5-star one please, that would be a huge help to achieving our goal to reach more of your peers, so we can all contribute to further and faster positive change. For your copy of the show notes, head to frombabieswithlove.org, where you can also join the How HR Leaders Change the World mailing list, and make sure you don't miss out on future episodes and bonus materials. And for harnessing the power of your role to create positive social change, I'm sending you a jumping up in the air virtual high five. See you next time on How HR Leaders Change the World.